said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Be water, my friend.
Hi guys, I'm here with Nick Winkelman at the Functional Training Summit here in Munich, and Nick just had a extended session, and actually in preparation also for this interview, I asked some people like, how was it? And everyone was like, wow, this is awesome, the guy's great. And then I said, what should I ask him? And they said, well, focus on, like, he's the mastermind of coaching. That's what they told me. And then now I'm really eager to find out. But the first question I would like to ask you is, how would you describe yourself, or how do you answer that cocktail party question? What do you do?
Well, I think for me, I'm a strength and conditioning coach that fell in love with the science of coaching out of necessity, because I spent so much time looking at the X's and O's, the reps, the sets, the periodization, the methods, and inevitably you kind of realize you can only take that so far. And that doesn't really differentiate many of the greats. A lot of them do the same stuff. But when you really look at, call it one coach that's okay, and a coach that you go observe who's inspirational, who's amazing, who connects with the athletes, the difference isn't so much what they do as much as it is how they do it. And that really drew me into all corners of coaching, from how do we motivate, how do we change behavior, to how should we best cue an athlete when they're learning to sprint or jump? Should you even cue? If you do, what should you say? Is there a science here? Or, as many people say, is it just an art? And I've really spent the last 10 years trying to find that out, and today we talked about that.
So what would be your answer right now? Is it an art or a science or a combination of both?
I think it's a science that gives you strong principles. But from those strong principles, there are, as many things, infinite combinations, and context is always critical. So I think the art is ever present, but now I believe people know how that artistic form comes to be. And the reason that's important is if I can teach a young coach principles around how to cue, how to give feedback, it's still up to them to decide what to say, when to say it, what tone they should use to say it. But if they understand the principles behind effective communication and learning, they can say something, reflect on how that interaction with the athlete went, and know what things they could modify the next time they cue that movement. And that's where I think you find a clear blend of science and art working together, as is the case with most things.
Do you have a certain framework that you use in order to instruct coaches to coach better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you open up the average motor learning book or educational psychology book, there's many, many chapters on, if you would, the domains or the components of coaching science. I think it really boils down into two big ones. And I'll use the science terms, and then we can talk about them. One is implicit learning or experiential learning. So think of children. Children learn almost exclusively through experiential learning. As they learn to run and walk, they stand up, they fall down, they figure it out, and inevitably they have fun playing with kids, and they learn how to move, in many cases, brilliantly. Versus explicit learning, think of a teacher. It's someone now that is giving you thoughts, giving you words to think about, and by thinking about those words or those instruction, that somehow is meant to make you better at the math problem, or make you better at the concept in English, or better at the concept in movement. So we can learn through experience, which is void of overcoaching, or we can learn through teaching, through words. So we kind of have this verbal and nonverbal way to learn. And I think if you boil the science down, those are really the two domains. Now, if I put it in coaching terms, over here I have the science of instruction, what to say before a movement, cueing, reminders, and then feedback after a movement. And then over here we have basically how to design a learning environment. So how do you design your session? What's the correct drill order? What drill should you even use? If you see 3 errors in a given movement, how do you come up with a drill to correct those? Is there a set of principles behind which you design what you do to improve learning? And the answer is yes. And we call that in science terms the constraint-led approach to teaching. Constrain the error to allow the right movement to emerge. So teaching and experiencing, those are your 2 constructs.
Okay, wow. What is that term again? Constraint?
Constraint-led approach. So someone who's interested in, okay, how do I design an environment? How do I design drills that just make my athletes better or clients better just by going through them. That is the science of a constraint-led approach to teaching. So let me give you an example. Imagine someone was learning to squat, and every time they're squatting down, their knees cave in. It's a very common thing to see with general population clients and athletes as well. What we now do is we would take this elastic mini band, we would put it around their knees. Now that, if you think about it, would actually pull the knees in further.
Right.
So initially you're like, well, why would you do that? If the knees are going in, why would you put a mini band around the knees to make them go in further? Well, now put yourself in, let's say, a bar scenario. If someone pushes you, what do? You instantly push back into them. So the way the body works is when we pull the knees in, it makes you more aware that they're getting pulled in. Therefore, you want to self-correct. You want to push them out because it's uncomfortable. So similarly, if we design drills that make them aware of the error, that in and of itself gives them the opportunity to self-correct. By nature, that's experiential learning.
Wow. Yeah, very cool. So you're pretty much a coach for coaches, actually, to develop coaches at one point. But now, and actually you gave the bar example, it made me think of Dublin somehow. Exactly. Because you recently became, and congratulations to that again, and you have to correct the title, but it's sort of the head of strength and conditioning and science for the Irish national rugby team.
Yeah. So, the last 15 years, I've really been operating in two streams of coaching athletes and coaching coaches. And I have found that they help each other so much. And now I'm the head of strength and conditioning or athletic performance and science for Irish Rugby, where I have the luxury of working with all of our national teams and the 4 major provincial professional rugby teams that play within the Pro 12 rugby circuit. And it allows me to definitely support some amazing coaches, but at the same time, step in strategically and help upgrade the athletes, especially around kind of these domains of speed and agility, which is where I spend a lot of my time as a coach.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Your strong suit really is sprinting and speed and agility. And I'd be interested in, when you have an athlete now in front of you, what is your approach in order to identify what they really need to work on?
Okay, so it's a great question. I think there's a number of things. I talk about the 4 Ps. And for me, the 4 Ps represent the buckets that I feel I need to have an insight into to best program and best coach them. So I talk about the concepts of position, pattern, power, and psychology. So let's start with the first 3, because those kind of relate to the body. So what I mean by position, very simply, is can they get into the right positions? Do they have mobility, stability to actually squat, flex their hip, extend their hip, rotate, based on the demands of the sport or the movements that they're learning? So things such as the functional movement screen, orthopedic screening, anything that kind of gets at giving us an insight, do they have these underpinning qualities, checks that box. Usually you do that in your screening of some sorts. The second box is patterning. And by patterning, I mean coordination. So you might be able to get into position A, let's say it's hip flexion, and position B, it's hip extension if we're talking about running gait. But that doesn't mean you effectively move from point A to point B. So patterning is really about the quality, the rhythm, the coordination of your movement. The third level is power. And basically what that looks at is, do you have the underpinning strength qualities, force production capabilities required to perform the movements that are required of you in the context of your sport, if we're talking about an athlete. Now, a movement like acceleration, where I'm trying to go as fast as I can from 0 to 10 meters, requires a lot of relative strength. So kilo for kilo, I need to be able to produce as much force or as much strength as possible. Conversely, if I'm teaching, let's say, a kettlebell swing, if they're not good at the kettlebell swing, I can just make the weight lighter. So certain movements really need certain strength and power qualities, others don't. So that's why we profile that. And then psychologically, a number of things. I want to get a sense of just who they are as a person. So I get to know the athlete. What are their hobbies? What are their likes? What are their dislikes? What do they define as a successful coach? What does a successful coach-athlete relationship look like? What behaviors do they feel have led to their success? What behaviors do they feel are basically holding them back? What motivates them? Why does that motivate them? Now, obviously, this isn't just in one sit down. That would be way too overwhelming. But that's the kind of information, oftentimes through just conversation, I'm trying to glean. As much so I can get to know them and be a chameleon, so I can modify my approach that best fits them. But I also need to utilize that information, as we'll talk about, when I coach them. Because if I understand their likes, their dislikes, their backgrounds, I can use stories, metaphors, analogies from their past experience, they're familiar, to help teach them something that's unfamiliar, maybe the movements that I'm teaching. So once I understand position, pattern, power, and psychology, which is an ever-evolving one, I can then start to design my programmatic approach. What do I do in the weight room? How do I manage movement skills on the field, thus coordination? And then how should I coach them? Are they a person that would prefer me to be very direct, say their name, tell them exactly what they did wrong and what I want them to do? Or are they someone that needs a bit more finesse in the relationship? Maybe the hands on the shoulder. I give them a little hint. I ask them a question. I lead them to the water, but I don't force them to drink it. So that's where it's a constant interdependent relationship. So hopefully, for the listeners and the watchers, the 4 Ps are kind of the domains that I try to find information about, and that guides what I do and how I do it.
All right. Do you have a story of a specific, let's say, case that was particularly difficult or challenging for you and where you had to reinvent your approach?
So I would put the difficult cases into 2 buckets. I've had the difficult cases where they're really physically talented, but their movement is not optimal. And their movement is not optimal, and that's causing them to get injured. So we have to strike this balance of changing their movement, but at the same time, when you look at them on the field, they're already successful. So it's striking the balance between making the changes you want, but not necessarily making the changes to their success on the field, all the while saying, well, we got to get rid of these injuries. So that's one domain of a difficult case I can talk about. And the other one is they could have the physical issues, but psychologically, right, they might not buy in. So let's start with that one because it's a bit more interesting. So in my former job, I would have spent a lot of time working with athletes preparing for the NFL Combine, where they get out of college and they're invited to this event and they have 3 days of interviews, medical and psychological evaluation. And then on the 4th day, they have to do a 40, they have to jump, they have to change direction, they have to do their actual skills. So they have to do all this physical profiling. But it's not football, right? So these are football players that are asked to do physical things that in and of themselves are not directly American football. So I can think of countless athletes around week 3, if they're not having early success in the training, meaning their results aren't moving along as fast as they think that they should, even though we would have forewarned them that this is an 8-week process and it takes that long to see your results realized, they kind of have forgotten that by now. And we'll hear athletes, say things like, pardon this, but F these drills, or I just want to get back to playing football, or what am I doing this process for? I'm a football player, right? So immediately they start to deny the process in front of them, and they start to create this separation. The second that starts to happen, 2 things follow. One, that can become a virus for the other athletes around them, but it also becomes a virus in their own psyche, which means they're not putting the effort that they otherwise would. They're not showing up on time. Oftentimes, they're not committing. So they're basically having a self-fulfilling prophecy. After that moment that they believe that, forget this isn't important, then we're going to see that change not happen, and thus they are going to be correct by the end. Right. So when I meet an athlete like that, I use a 3-pronged approach that could be helpful for people. Number one, when I see those behaviors in a group context, I bring the group together and I will give some kind of post recap around let's say the importance of focus. And I'll ask them, what did you all focus on in today's session? Some people might answer, some people don't. So I use that to get an understanding of where everyone's head was at that day. And usually by the question, they know that something was up. And I basically said this to them: if you don't focus on something, you can be distracted by anything. Right. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay. So, and I reinforce this. As much as I want you to do these drills, I want you to do them with the intention that I'm encouraging you to take on board. So when I cue you, that cue is as valuable as the drill itself. Inevitably over 8 weeks, the athletes come to appreciate and understand that cue is like a light in the dark. Now, this athlete that maybe I'm specifically talking to probably isn't paying attention. Their head might be down. So then the next session, let's say I see the behavior continues. They're not emphasizing, they're not focusing. Then I go to the one-on-one scenario. I'll wait for everyone to walk off the field, and I will go up to them as they'll say they're taking off their boots, their cleats, hand on the shoulder, and I say, hey, so-and-so, how you feeling? Yeah, coach, I'm fine. Like, okay, well, I just want you to notice, I've noticed you've seen, at least what it perceives to me to be a little disengaged, and you're struggling a little bit with some of the drills. And I just want to make sure if there's something else you want to be doing or something else that you need help with, I'm happy to spend some extra time. So now I'm basically showing them that I care, and even though maybe you've been expressing some behavior that's not mature or desired, I understand that there's a reason for that behavior, and I want to try to find what that inner struggle is. And oftentimes, hopefully you can stop there, okay? If the behavior continues to enact, then I will actually sit them down one-on-one for a formal meeting. And so that's kind of the process that I use. And I've always found once you get to the formal meeting, it's uncomfortable for them, because at that point I'll call them out. Not in a negative way, but I say, this is what I'm seeing. This is how I think it's affecting you. And this is how I think it's affecting others. I wanted to see if this is what you've been experiencing and how we might find a way forward. Sometimes it's constructive, sometimes they get mad, but every time when they come back, they're changed because they've reflected on it. Now, one of the examples within the session, this kind of group speech that I would have found to be most effective with the athletes that disengage is as follows. I say, what are we preparing for? NFL Combine. And what does the NFL Combine lead to? The draft. And what does the draft lead to? Playing in the NFL. So I'll ask them, do we all agree that this is a necessary step, a requirement to play in the NFL? Yes. And what do you guys want to do? We want to play in the NFL, exactly. And who's going to give you the opportunity to play in the NFL? One of the 32 teams. And who designed the Combine? The 32 teams. And what are the interview questions, at least today, right, wrong, or otherwise, they want to ask you? They want to ask you about your 40. They want to ask you about the 5-10, 5-10. We are not here to judge. We are here to execute. And the second you realize that you're not running a 40, you're not doing an L drill, you're not doing a vertical jump, but you are preparing for the next level of your career. And you have to ask yourself a simple question. Do you want to put a period, a question mark, or an exclamation mark behind your college career? Because gentlemen, you won't play another snap of football until you go to the NFL Combine. And that, in a group context, sends a very powerful message, right. One that this is bigger than just me, and I'm looking back on a career of everything I've done to this point. Why would I potentially throw it away or throw part of it away by not giving my best to this amazing opportunity? So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, very much. I'm very amazed also about how much psychological work there goes into.
There's never been a combine day one that I have not felt like I was going to throw up because of that fact. Because you are dealing with this thing that we call the human psyche that is incredibly variable. And you can read every psychological book in the world, but if you don't understand tone and body posture and how all the stuff that wraps the words, how that affects the interaction, you're not going to make the same impact. So I feel always like a student, like a baby, when I study psychology, when I try to generate relationships. And I think that humility maybe allows me to connect at a level that says, listen, I'm just here to make you better. And once they feel that, it's cliche, but it's true. Once they know that that's authentic, I believe some of these other, call it psychological tricks, biohacks, become easier to use on someone who's acceptant of them.
Mm-hmm. Did you come across personally, out of personal experience, maybe one quality, one psychological quality in athletes that you say predicts future success?
Yes. Gosh, I can't tell you. Now, this might sound odd coming from a strength and conditioning coach. I'm not a huge sport fan, meaning I don't spend a lot of my time, at least in the States, on ESPN or Sky Sports, watching all of the stats. I'm a fan of movement. I'm a fan of sport as it is, but I wouldn't follow it. And in not following it with a lot of the combine guys, I wouldn't know their college careers. So I'm coming at it from a blank slate. So I don't know who's supposed to go in the first round or the last round. Inevitably, I come to find out. The reason I share that is I think it allows me to come to them in a much more of an open state.
Right.
And in doing so, I have seen really two major qualities come to mind when it comes to, call it prediction, assuming they don't have any injuries of future success. One of them, again, it's cliche, but it is so true, is humility. Because humility breeds hunger. Richie McCaw is a very famous rugby player from New Zealand, from the All Blacks. Most people probably have heard a hint of his name. And in his biography or autobiography, which is referenced by a great book called Legacy, they talk about something that he does every day. And that is in his journal. He writes 2 words: start again. Start again. And start again isn't so much that, okay, I need to start my training again or I need to reread the book, as much as it is a reminder to reset your humility, to reset your openness, to know that if every day I empty the proverbial cup of perception, expectations, and ideas, I'm going to be able to take in new information, integrate that new information, engage, understand the people around me so much better. So I believe with humility, the mantra that I love so much that I'm probably going to get it tattooed here in the coming months, is start again. And I believe that is what a lot of the greats do. Every day they come in with a novice, new learner mindset. With that, then, you can have someone that's humble, but just can't take it. They can't put in the work. They can't handle the work. They can't handle the struggle. They can't be dealing with injury, dealing with getting kicked off the team and fighting back. And those that I feel inherently have that, and we hear it's a buzz term, we're hearing the words grit getting thrown around, but the word that would have preceded that in the world that I operate in that I like is resilience. And specifically, there's a scale called the dispositional resiliency scale. And it came out of business, and I believe a study that was called the Bell Study, where they looked at, from a business perspective, who flourished and who failed, and what were the qualities with those in this business that flourished. And they came up with 3 core qualities that underpinned resiliency, or said otherwise, the ability to bounce back, deal with struggle, keep your grit, your stick-to-itness, as I believe Angela Duckworth says. And those 3 qualities are as follows. 1 is commitment. So these people are process-oriented. They understand that, Rome wasn't built in a day, and they have to engage with the struggle that is the process, be aware of the process, because only in the goodness that they bring to every day, only in giving their best to the small things, does that give birth to the big things. The next one was control, which means you have to have a sense of self-agency. What I mean by that is this. Oh, if I'm successful, it's because I had a great coach or because of the great team. Or if I failed, it's because I have bad luck. So people that don't think that they have a lot of control, you hear them bring up the term luck quite a bit. Whereas people that have high self-agency or high self-control or belief in self-control believe, I'm in charge of my domain. I'm in charge of me, and good, bad, or otherwise, I will take accountability. And in doing so, they drive themselves actively, proactively to make the right steps because they believe their control in doing so will lead to a better version of them. And then finally, challenge, which probably is the most cliche one, in that they look at challenge as opportunity. They embrace struggle. They know the moment where it gets the hardest is one step closer than when all of a sudden they'll have a breakthrough and it becomes easy. And that struggle might last for a day, it might last for years, but inevitably they will continue to pursue. And if you read about the greats, from Benjamin Franklin, right, to famous people in Europe, they talk about Napoleon all the time, just all the greats.
Right.
There was this state in their life where they had to push through incredible struggle. Mozart, risk of failure. And because they continued to push, despite what mom, dad, society said, Proust is another example of this, they had a breakthrough. And oftentimes, funny enough, a lot of their great works happened towards the end of their careers. And oftentimes, many of these individuals had a sense that they were going to die young, and they did, but their great work happened in the final years of their life. Nowadays, we have better health, so hopefully that's not the issue, but nonetheless, the principle is such. You have to look at challenge as opportunity. It's one thing now that you know you shouldn't do in the future, which is one thing less bringing you towards what you should do. So commitment, control, challenge, resilience, humility, start again. Those are the things that the greats do.
Fantastic info. Nick, thanks so much for that. And it reminds me a little bit of one of my favorite books growing up as a basketball player, and I ended up playing in the NCAA then. Yeah. It was The Score Takes Care of Itself by Bill Walsh.
Yes.
And it reminded me a little bit of his struggles in the beginning with the San Francisco 49ers, where he lost seasons but stuck to his approach and then ended up 5 Super Bowls.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. So it's amazing. I think, again, there's a wonderful book for people that really want it. If that concept we just spoke on strikes a nerve with them, they should read a book by Robert Greene called Mastery. And in that book, he just discusses this exact concept from the viewpoint of many great individuals spanning hundreds of years. And the one commonality, again, was struggle. Struggle needs to be recontextualized as opportunity. And probably the biggest book now that's very popular in the NFL is written by Ryan Holiday, It's called The Obstacle is the Way.
Yes.
And would you believe that Ryan Holiday was an apprentice under Robert Greene? And if you read Mastery and The Obstacle is the Way, you will find two complementary books with a very interesting style to approach this concept of getting better at getting better. So the essence of your biohacking.
Wow. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Ryan Holiday. It's so funny that you mentioned him. Now it comes together. And I'm a big fan of the Stoic approach that is also recommended, promoted by Tim Ferriss quite a bit, and he's a friend of Ryan Holiday's.
Yes. And Robert Greene would have preceded them both. I mean, Robert Greene's original work would have even preceded Malcolm Gladwell, and Malcolm has become very popular, not necessarily of going into deep history, he does at times, but again, utilizing multiple points of view to bring forth a central idea. And just on that note, because if people are listening to this, they probably like podcasts. Timothy Ferriss, wonderful, but a new one is by Malcolm Gladwell called The Revisionist History, I believe it's called. And he basically does 10 episodes, and it's basically an audio version of his books. He attacks a very interesting problem or interesting idea from a very tangential story, and he brings it back to something we can all take home and learn from. So I think that's aligned with this.
That actually triggers me to shift gears a little bit, because I want to find out a little more about you. And you just mentioned, and you mentioned before, that you're a podcast fan.
Yes.
So what are maybe some of the other podcasts that you listen to?
Yeah, so I listen to Timothy Ferriss all the time. And I listen to Timothy Ferriss oftentimes. I think he's a great interviewer, but because of the people he's interviewing. And from that, I'm now listening to Malcolm Gladwell's. I think Joe Rogan's at times can be quite interesting. He's an amazing character.
He's an entertainer.
He's an entertainer, and I love the people he has on there. I'm a big fan also of blogs. I think one of the blogs that I've just become attracted to over the last probably a year and a half is one by Maria Popova called Brain Pickings. And basically what she does is she takes, for the most part, historical pieces of work, kind of like Ryan Holiday, and she recontextualizes them for modern days. And if you listen, Timothy Ferriss interviews her. It's the only podcast that he continuously reads. So,
all right.
Brain Pickings by Maria Popova. So
yeah, I heard that actually on this podcast. Now I remember it because it sounded so familiar.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'm starting to get into audiobooks. I never had a commute when I lived in the United States. So I had no reason. The audio medium for me, when I'm home with my kids, I'm probably not going to be listening to a podcast. But now that I drive a bit more, it's given me an opportunity to engage with these mediums, which is wonderful because it's a much quicker way to filter down information and get at maybe when you are reading what you want to focus on.
Wow, it seems like you really are a natural learner. Do you have books that you give to other people? Is there maybe one book that you particularly give very, very often?
I think the book that I find myself recommending to people more often than not, especially if, let's say, you do an interview and someone didn't get the position, they want to know, well, what should I go read? I talk a lot about the book Primal Leadership. I read it probably 9 years ago. It's written by Daniel Goleman, who popularized really emotional intelligence and social intelligence. And Primal Leadership attacks emotional intelligence from the standpoint of more business leadership. So I think out of the book jumps a bit more utility for someone who needs to engage with another human being, especially from a leadership perspective. And he talks about these 4 principles of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and then social relationship management, with the central tenet being empathy. And the ability to empathize, right? Which is different than understand. Empathize is be able to share in their emotional state, which is for me a higher level of understanding. And in doing so, I think it's such a core competency that oftentimes is missed, or people just have it innately, and one that I think we can all get better at. Just if we can block ourselves, if we can get ourselves away from just reflecting on our own world and understand how our world interacts with others, which I'm forced to do as a coach anyhow, I think you will live a much more present, which is your mindfulness focus that we're seeing right now, a much more present, fulfilling life. And emotional intelligence is just, I feel it's the underpinning quality of anything anyone should learn. Because if you are self-aware, guess what happens? You notice what happened in that session. You notice the points in that book that most apply to your life. Self-awareness, I believe, is the substance of learning how to learn.
I love that. And we actually had UJ Ramdas, the founder of the 5-Minute Journal, on this podcast as well. And he talked about mindfulness. And I think it's a huge way to get more out of every situation.
Yeah, 100%. My friend, who would be great to get on this at one point, his name's Dr. Wade Gilbert. He comes from Canada. He now is a professor. Both him and his wife are sports psychologists at Fresno State University. And his expertise, while it's in sports psychology, is in coach education. So he's specifically interested in how coaches get better at coaching. And he talks about a number of things, but in all of our conversations, the number one thing that resonated with me was one word, and that was notice. If you can simply notice how you affect others, how others affect you, don't judge your emotions, notice them. And once you notice them, you can say, well, gosh, I feel really bad right now. But acting in a way in anger probably wouldn't be effective in this situation. So the fact that I know that almost calms me down. And then it allows you to engage the situation in a much more objective, step back type of mindset. And when he talks about noticing, he's like, every day if coaches simply wrote down a few things that they did that really, really worked, that they want to continue to do, and a few things that didn't really work, albeit small, things that they want to get better at. Imagine what that does. After a month, you now know, wow, I'm really effective at this, and I'm going to keep doing that. And I'm going to recognize situations where doing that is helpful. But at the same time, I now know exactly what I need to go get better at, what podcasts I should read, or what podcasts I should listen to, what blog I should read, what book I should buy. Because that brings me into a point that I've been talking about quite a bit. I think in society right now, we're learning because we have more access to information, but it's cliche, right? We have more access to information, but obesity, disease, all these things are getting worse despite our knowledge. And I believe that's because we've become oftentimes passive learners, in that we allow our Twitter, our LinkedIn, our Facebook feed to drive what we do next. Now, I know that's true for one simple reason. They recently did a study on where coaches get most of their information. Now, this is quite interesting. I believe it was 93% of coaches. Now, mind you, 382 coaches across 22 sports in 30 countries. Those might be vice versa, but 382 coaches were polled. And they're asked all these different things about where they go get information. And 92% of the things that they do are considered more casual, social, peer-to-peer. Research of that ranked only 1.8% of them read research, read evidence, truth, if you would.
Only 1.8%.
1.8%. Blogs, social media, and YouTube ranked significantly higher than evidence. And of them, I think it was 66% get their information from peer-to-peer, who's also getting their information from these other resources. So I bring that up because I believe that if someone really was to go through a session and notice where they wanted to get better, one, it allows them to ask more focused questions to their peers. Two, it also allows them to go into Google Scholar or go into PubMed or go into Google for that matter and query exactly what they want to get better at. And it narrows their focus down and makes it relevant. It instantly takes all this information and allows me to have a guiding light to what's the most important piece of information that will make me better so I can make others better. And that's my personal approach to going through and dissolving the mass chaos of information to getting clearly to what I think is going to make me better, to always make others better.
I have sometimes a little bit of a problem in my industry, also in biohacking, that people tend to read the same books, listen to the same podcast, and then have this peer-to-peer exchange, and that leads to a homogenized, like society, sort of a circle.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think it's important to get that number up from 1.8% because I'm pretty sure it's the same number in many other fields, not only coaching.
And you hear a lot of coaches say, listen, I'm a practical person. And that comment almost in and of itself has now become a statement of, listen, evidence is fine, but that research wasn't done on my field, or it wasn't done on my athletes, and that's all well and good, but research answers a question. And if you can go in there and appreciate the question it asked and appreciate the answer that they found, then it's up to you to figure out how to best apply that information to your world. It's not up to the researchers to design the perfect study just for you, because their question is guided from the last question that they asked, and it's this perpetual state. But the problem is, I don't believe that many students are taught how to practically evaluate research. Right. In getting a PhD, I never expected to go into research by itself. Well, I'm going to research my whole life. I'll do it in a collaborative sense. I won't be the first author because I'm going to stay in the practical domain, but I'm going to stay engaged with it. That process taught me how to deconstruct research and how to get the most out of it, how to see good versus poor research, which now allows me to take that information and integrate it into my practice so much faster. And I believe I know what I would say to someone and to teach them how to do that over a 30-minute lecture, which isn't that difficult. So those are the kind of resources that we need to upgrade that 1.8, because I think research for a lot of people is intimidating.
It is.
And they wouldn't even know where to get it. So they focus on their blogs and their podcasts, which are fine, but from an evidence perspective, they're at the bottom rung.
Right.
And we need to be able to go find from that. Good, start with opinion.
Right.
And then go do your fact checking. And if it comes out to be true, awesome. Now you have research and a practical form with which you can go apply it. But don't just take their opinion at face value, or even take your own experience. It's called the confirmation bias.
Right.
You're going to look for success in your program. You'll go find it, which means we're not our best critics, which is why evidence is that much more important. People critiquing us and going out and searching for truth.
One follow-up question. What for you is a big warning signal for bad science?
Oh, goodness. I think for bad science, there's a couple things. One, when you're making big claims and it's only the first study, or you're making big claims and the amount of participants in the study was quite low, or you're making big claims that this information generalizes to everybody, but you are doing the research on a very specific population. I would say those usually are the big ones. So for most people, where they get into trouble is if you go to the discussion, the last part of a research article, that's where the researcher starts giving you their opinion.
Right.
Now, even though they're trying to put evidence against their opinion, you can put evidence against any opinion and make it look truthful. Which is why if you focus your attention on the methods section, what was their question? What was their population? How did they test their question, meaning were their methods sound, and what did they find? If you just stay in that zone and you just add that over research, you start to get a clear, concise story yourself. And I think also then research, what it does is it probably, for me, it drives the blogs you should read. It drives the books you should read. Because if you read a research, like, man, this is getting at something that I feel so important. Well, then go find someone that's written a book, that put a narrative, that put a story to it. And then it's just this process of, okay, what did they reference? Let me read that. What did they reference? Let me read that. And it's this circular process that inevitably you become an expert in your own right if the passion is there.
I love that process. Yeah, this is excellent. This is the first time we ever had that on this podcast, okay. I think, described in a way. So super. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I've heard it other places, so I won't take credit. But it's definitely, it's the process I use. It's helpful. So,
one question tied to that maybe, but what is, it could be in your professional or your social life, but what do you consider your biggest waste of time?
Well, I think wasting time is the biggest waste of time. So I'm not going to judge what people spend their time on. But I look at, there's two things that are important to me personally: my family and my profession. I hate the word job. I don't look at what I do as a job. It's a complete passion for me. It's as important for me as anything else. So if my time is not going towards playing with my two kids, spending time with my wife, if it's not there, or if it's not being directed towards reading, engaging around my profession, those would be my two domains. Now, I also appreciate the importance of being social and relaxing. But for me, when I'm being social and being relaxing, I'm either with my wife, with friends, or with my wife and my kids. So I still put that social, that unplugging, which is absolutely critical, and I myself, a professional, don't do enough of. That still falls into that category. So that time where I'm relaxing, if it's not being spent with my wife and friends or kids, I'm probably not socially doing something that's as important, unless I'm out at a conference like this, which is, even then, it's with friends. So professional and family, those are my definitions. So what I would encourage others is look at what your circles of importance are. If you're spending the vast majority of your time outside one of those, then likely you're wasting your time. You have to ask yourself why and figure out a pathway to redirect it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. By the way, because you talked about friends and family and before primal leadership and the book, is it possible for a coach to develop friendly relationships with players during, like, let's say the NFL Combine, and stay friends for?
Yeah, I think we come to appreciate one another, we're not going out to dinner, let's say. I'm not going to the house and playing video games with them, which they love to do. We'll do outings as a team, but I believe it keeps that professional, purposeful barrier between them. Not always by design, but just out of the function of the way it works. So yeah, I think it absolutely is the case that you can have a friendly relationship with an athlete. But the second that friendliness turns into more of a social environment where we're out or about, we're outside of the context of the practice, that's where I think there can start to be some emotional connection that makes the athlete might feel like, as a friend, would they call you out on something? Or they'd say, well, I'm not going to do that. That's my buddy. So the second you draw that line, it decreases your ability to be, when it's appropriate, the hard leader, which is the person that needs to tell it how it is and identify the pathway to make a change. So I couldn't give you specifics on what I feel is crossing the line, but I believe most people know it once they've crossed it.
Yeah. That also reminds me a little bit of Bill Walsh and his approach. I think that...
But many of the great coaches, right, wrong, or otherwise, have a pretty big gap between them and the athlete, which is why oftentimes the strength coach, I would say on the emotional scale of head coach and athlete, the strength coach is probably more in the middle. They're a bit more of the hand on the shoulder type person, and I think that's important. That's part of their role. That
was during my basketball days definitely the case as well, yeah, that the physical trainers and the physiotherapists were much closer to us. And
because you need emotional support. You do. And I think providing emotional support doesn't mean you're crossing that line. So,
Nick, this is already so much really cool information, and I'm super impressed that coming from it's in an NFL background, we hear about Ryan Holiday, and philosophical concepts, emotional intelligence. This is very exciting to see these fields overlap. Yes. I have a couple more questions for you. One is also a personal one. Would you take me through your first 90 minutes of your day?
This is the closest I'm going to be right now to getting on Tim Ferriss's thing, because I love the questions. I love the questions. So
it always gives actionable advice to people.
He does, and I think there's a lot of people on there, who they're like, oh gosh, I wake up when I wake up, and it's not perfect. I would say for me, I am trying to move towards a much more focused model. So I'll give you what the last 10 days have been like, which I think is starting to metamorphosize into what I'd like it to be. Consider I just moved to Ireland a couple months ago, had a little bit of a shakeup. So I get up every morning at 6. I go to the gym it's 5 minutes away from my house. So I try to be in there by 6:15, 6:30. I'll do 20 minutes of cardio, typically in a fasted state. And then I'll go in and do no more than 15 to 20 minutes of typically more volume-based 2 or 3 movements. That's it, strength work. Typically, I'll do that for, a phase of 6 weeks to 8 weeks. And then inevitably what'll start to happen is I'll do my cardio later in the day, and that session will turn more into a proper strength. And I'll kind of go back between these principles of more anaerobic type work and strength work. For me, the gym, I try not to overstress myself on it. I spend all day long thinking about programming, thinking about periodization. So I want it to be fun, engaging. It's very field-based for me, but I also I believe in balance. So I try to create balance in the energy systems and what I'm working on over the course of the week. From there, I come back. What's nice is in Ireland, they start work at 9 versus I used to start at 8. So that gives me an extra kind of hour to pocket. So normally in there, I try to do kind of your high priority work. So if I have a few emails in the queue that I know I want to get out, maybe I'm working on a paper, I want to get an hour of focused writing in on that paper, or maybe it's spending a bit more time. My wife had a hard night because our son was up. I try to make breakfast for everyone, maybe a bit better breakfast. So I don't put on what I prioritize, but whatever that day is, I want to do something that's important. At this point, I'm pretty energized. I'll either drive to one of our teams or I'll head into work. And from there, the day will unfold again in as best I can, a very prioritized way. So.
All right, thanks for sharing. Okay, this is the last question, and this is sort of a two-way question, because I always ask that at the end. If there's one thing that you would like every one of these listeners to remember, what would it be? And I'd like to tie that to maybe you have an advice for the young trainers here at the summit right now, and maybe an advice that you would give your younger self when you started out. What would that be? So I think what's good is I think we've kind of covered a lot of the big rocks that I believe in and that I would have likely told myself. So if we boil those down, there's a number of them. One is
patience. When we're in a field that is based on information and gaining knowledge, as well as dealing with the incredible diversity that is the human condition, there is nothing that can accelerate that process. And if you read the likes of Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene, they talk about this. So I think that if you have patience and can understand that as long as each day, one step after another, brick after brick, you are laying the knowledge, the professional signature that is important to you, I believe you need to have comfort in that. Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to have the emotion of impatience. You will. It will breed anxiety. And I think when those emotions bubble up, you then have to know that, gosh, the best people in the world at what they do have all felt this. No one in a profession that was really worth doing didn't go through an ongoing state of struggle through their entire life. Sometimes they have highs where there's clarity, but most of their life is set in these lows of working hard day in, day out, self-questioning, unsure, in a perpetual state of struggle. But again, if we are patient and we know that day after day we are prioritizing, we are gaining information, synthesizing, applying, inevitably you will progressively become a better version of yourself and the version of yourself that you were seeking from day one. And oftentimes you'll have a moment of clarity that you're kind of there, and then you'll dip right back down, because perfection isn't an end state, it's a process. So that would be, I guess, the number one recommendation I would give to really young and old coaches alike. I've heard this question about what would I tell my younger self answered many ways. And I believe that most of the people I respect have used the same answer, so I'm going to poach the answer, in that I wouldn't really change anything that I did, because I don't think I'd be here today had I not had those struggles, those mistakes, those experiences. One thing I was doing at the time that kept me centered was this thirst to get better. And every day I just kept step after step trying to do things through conversation, through reading, engaging, and synthesizing. I always tried to take information, put it into a usable form, and apply it. So I tried to work with information. But was there no uncertainty? Absolutely not. Was there no anxiety or self-questioning? Absolutely not. So what I would tell myself is what I just told everyone else. Embrace the struggle, because the struggle is the stepping stones on the way to perfection, which is never going to be there because you'll keep pushing past it, which is why it's a process.
Wow, Nick, thanks. Thanks for sharing this great advice to take away. I think in combining that with what you said previously, be patient, be humble, be resilient, and you're in a good path to make something.
Just keep going. That's the thing.
Great. And now maybe when people want to find out more about you and what you do and then follow you, where can they find you?
At this point, I do use social media quite a bit. So on Twitter, it's at Nick Winkelman. So they'd spell it right in Germany, but they spell it wrong in the US. So it's WINKELMAN, one N. So Nick Winkelman, and then on Facebook is I keep updated on where I'm presenting, what I'm doing, and probably in the next year and a half, I'll have a proper website that people can go to, which I would put on those social media sites.
Great. Check out Nick's work. It's really worth checking out. And if you listen to this episode, then you know this man is telling a lot of things that we can take for our lives and learn from him. So thanks, and stay in the flow. Until next time.